The Psychological Test, Part 1 of 6, Author Edogawa Ranpo. It is not known exactly what prompted Seiichiro Fukiya to contemplate the terrifying crime I am about to describe, nor what his exact motives were. Even if they were known, it would have little bearing on this story. Seeing that he was attending a university while partially working his way through, one might suppose he was pressed for tuition fees. He was a student of rare brilliance and an extremely hard worker, so it is certain he resented that trivial side jobs took up his time, preventing him from fully engaging in the reading and contemplation he loved. But would a person commit such a heinous crime for such a reason? Perhaps he was an innate villain, and perhaps he could not control various other desires besides his need for tuition. Be that as it may, half a year has passed since the idea first came to him. During that time, after endless hesitation and relentless thought, he finally made the decision to go through with it. One day, by chance, he became close friends with a classmate, Isamu Saito. That was the beginning of it all. At first, of course, he had no ulterior motive. But halfway through, he began to approach Saito with a vague purpose in mind. And as he got closer, that vague purpose gradually became clearer. For about a year, Saito had been renting a room in a private house in a quiet, upscale neighborhood in the Yamanote area. The owner of the house was the widow of a government official, an old woman nearing 60. Although she could live comfortably on the income from several rental properties left by her late husband, she had no children and used to say, "Money is my only reliance." She found her greatest pleasure in saving little by little, lending small amounts of money to reliable acquaintances. Her reason for renting a room to Saito was probably partly for security, as she lived in a household of women. But she must have also calculated that the room rent alone would increase her monthly savings. And rumor had it that, though it's a rare story these days, it seems the psychology of a miser is the same in all ages and cultures. Besides her superficial bank deposits, she had a vast amount of cash hidden in a secret place in her home. Fukiya felt tempted by this money. What value is there in that old dotard having such a large sum? Wouldn't it be highly rational to use it for the tuition of a young man with a future like myself? Put simply, this was his theory. So, through Saito, he tried to gain as much knowledge about the old woman as possible. He tried to uncover the secret hiding place of that large sum of money. However, until the day he heard that Saito had accidentally discovered the hiding place, he did not have a definite plan. You know, for an old lady, it's an admirable idea. Usually people hide money under the floor or in the ceiling, but hers is in an unexpected place. There's a large potted maple tree in the alcove of the inner room, right? It's at the bottom of that pot. That's her hiding place. No thief would ever think money was hidden in a flower pot. You could say she's a genius of a miser. Saito laughed, seemingly amused as he said this. Since then, Fukiya's thoughts gradually became more concrete. He tried to devise the safest method, taking into account every possible scenario for each step of transferring the old woman's money to his tuition fund. It was a far more difficult task than he expected. Compared to this, any complex math problem was nothing. As mentioned earlier, he spent half a year just refining this idea. The difficulty, needless to say, lay in how to escape punishment. Moral obstacles, or the pangs of conscience, were not much of an issue for him. Just as he did not consider Napoleon's large-scale murders to be crimes, but rather admired them, he thought it natural for a talented young man to sacrifice an old dotard with one foot in the grave in order to nurture his own talents. The old woman rarely went out. She stayed curled up in the back room all day in silence. Even when she occasionally went out, a rustic maid honestly kept watch on her orders while she was away. Despite all of Fukiya's painstaking efforts, there was not a single gap in the old woman's precautions. What if he waited for a time when both the old woman and Saito were out, tricked the maid into running an errand, and stole the money from the flower pot in the meantime? At first, Fukiya considered such methods, but it was an extremely thoughtless idea. If it became known that he was alone in that house even for a short time, that alone would be enough to cast suspicion on him. He spent a full month devising and discarding various foolish methods of this kind. For example, tricks to make it look like Saito, the maid, or an ordinary thief had stolen it, or methods of sneaking in without making a sound when the maid was alone and stealing it out of her sight, or doing the job in the middle of the night while the old woman slept. He considered every possible scenario, but each and every one contained a high probability of discovery. There was no other way but to do away with the old woman. He finally reached this terrible conclusion. Although he didn't know exactly how much money the old woman had, considering various points, he didn't think it was an amount worth obsessing over to the point of risking murder. Wasn't it too cruel to kill an innocent human being for a known amount of money? But even if it wasn't a large sum by the world's standards, it would be more than enough to satisfy the impoverished Fukiya. Moreover, according to his thinking, the issue was not the amount of money, but simply making the discovery of the crime absolutely impossible. For that, no sacrifice was too great. At first glance, murder seems to be a job many times more dangerous than simple theft. But that is merely an illusion. Indeed, if it is a crime committed with the expectation of being discovered, murder is undoubtedly the most dangerous of all crimes. However, if one considers the difficulty of discovery rather than the severity of the crime as a standard, in some cases, such as Fukiya's, theft is actually a more dangerous undertaking. On the contrary, the method of eliminating the discoverer of an evil deed is cruel but leaves no worries. Since ancient times, great villains have committed murders ruthlessly and calmly. Isn't it because of these bold murders that they are not caught? Then, assuming he were to do away with the old woman, would it really be without risk? Since confronting this problem, Fukiya thought it over for several months. How he developed his ideas during that long period will become clear to the reader as the story progresses, so I will omit it here. In any case, as a result of an incredibly meticulous analysis and synthesis that an ordinary person could never fathom, he devised an absolutely safe method without a single flaw. Now, all he had to do was wait for the right time, but it came unexpectedly soon. One day, it was confirmed that Saito would be out until evening due to school matters, and the maid would be sent on an errand, meaning neither of them would return home until evening. That was exactly 2 days after Fukiya had completed his final preparatory act. This final preparatory act, which needs to be explained in advance, was a certain action to confirm whether the hiding place was still the same today, half a year after he had first heard about it from Saito. On that day, 2 days before the old woman's murder, he visited Saito, entered the inner room, which was the old woman's room for the first time, and exchanged various small talk with her. He gradually steered the conversation in one direction, and he frequently mentioned the old woman's wealth and the rumor that she was hiding it somewhere. Every time the word hide came up, he subtly paid attention to the old woman's eyes. Then, just as he expected, her eyes would gently dart to the flower pot in the alcove, though by then it had been replanted with a pine instead of a maple each time. By repeating this a few times, Fukiya was able to confirm without a shadow of a doubt. The Psychological Test, Part 2 of 6. Now, the day had arrived. Wearing a student cloak over his official university uniform and cap, and donning ordinary gloves, he headed for his destination. After much thought, he had ultimately decided not to disguise himself. If he were to use a disguise, purchasing the materials, finding a place to change, and various other factors would leave clues that could lead to the crime's discovery. It would only complicate matters without being effective at all. It was a kind of philosophy of his that the method of a crime should be as simple and blatant as possible, as long as there was no fear of discovery. The point was, he just had to avoid being seen entering the target house. Even if it became known that he had passed in front of the house, it wouldn't matter in the least. He often took walks in that area, so he could just explain it away by saying he had merely been taking a walk that day. At the same time, if he was seen by an acquaintance on his way to the house, which he absolutely had to take into account, it went without saying whether it was better to be in a strange disguise or his usual official uniform and cap. Regarding the time of the crime, why did he choose the dangerous daytime when he knew that if he just waited, there would be a convenient night, a night when both Saito and the maid were away? Like his choice of clothing, this was to eliminate unnecessary secrecy from the crime. However, only when he stood in front of the target house did even he, like an ordinary thief, no, perhaps even more nervously than them, look around in all directions. The old woman's house was a detached building separated from its neighbors by hedges, and on the opposite side, the high concrete wall of a wealthy man's mansion continued for about a block. Because it was a quiet residential neighborhood, there were times, even during the day, when there was absolutely no one passing by. Fortunately, when Fukiya arrived there, not even a stray dog was in sight on the street. He opened and closed the lattice door, which normally made a terribly loud metallic sound, very slowly and silently. Then, from the dirt floor of the entranceway, he called out in a very low voice, as a precaution against the neighbors. When the old woman came out, he used the excuse that he had something confidential to discuss regarding Saito and was shown into the inner room. Shortly after they sat down, the old woman stood up to get tea, excusing herself by saying, "Unfortunately, the maid is not here." Fukiya had been eagerly waiting for this exact moment. When the old woman bent down slightly to open the sliding door, he suddenly grabbed her from behind and used both arms. Though he wore gloves, he tried to avoid leaving finger marks as much as possible, to strangle her with all his might. The old woman merely let out a choking sound from her throat and hardly struggled at all. However, in her agony, her fingertips grasped at the air and brushed against a folding screen set up nearby, making a slight scratch. It was an antique 2-panel gold folding screen depicting the 6 immortal poets in brilliant colors, and it was mercilessly torn for about an inch right across the face of Ono no Komachi. Once he made sure the old woman had stopped breathing, he laid her body down there and looked at the tear in the screen with a slightly concerned expression. But upon reflection, there was nothing to worry about. Such a thing couldn't possibly serve as evidence. Therefore, he went to the target alcove, grasped the base of the pine tree, and pulled it completely out of the flower pot, soil and all. As expected, there was something wrapped in oiled paper at the bottom. Calmly, he unwrapped the package, took out a new large wallet from his right pocket, and put about half of the bills, which amounted to a full 5,000 yen, into it. He then returned the wallet to his pocket, wrapped the remaining bills in the oiled paper, and hid them back at the bottom of the flower pot as before. Of course, this was to conceal the evidence that the money had been stolen. Only the old woman herself knew the total amount of her savings, so no one would suspect a thing even if it was reduced by half. Next, he rolled up a floor cushion that was there and pressed it against the old woman's chest. This was a precaution to prevent blood from splattering. He took a jackknife from his left pocket, opened the blade, thrust it deeply aiming for her heart, gave it a sharp twist and pulled it out. Then, He cleanly wiped the blood off the knife with the fabric of that same cushion and put it back into his pocket. He thought there was a fear of resuscitation if he merely strangled her. In other words, it was the old finishing stroke. So why hadn't he used the blade from the start? He feared that if he did, blood might accidentally splatter onto his clothes. Here, I must briefly explain about the wallet he put the bills into and the jackknife he just used. He had purchased them at a festival stall specifically for this purpose. He timed his visit for the most crowded part of the festival, chose the busiest stall, threw down the exact change as priced, grabbed the items, and disappeared so quickly that neither the merchant nor the many customers had time to memorize his face. And both of these items were extremely common ones that could not possibly have any distinguishing marks. The Psychological Test, Part 3 of 6. Now, after taking thorough care to ensure no clues were left behind, Fukiya remembered to close the sliding doors and slowly walked out to the entranceway. There, while tying his shoelaces, he thought about footprints, but there was no further worry on that point. The dirt floor of the entranceway was hard plaster, and the street outside was bone dry from a spell of clear weather. All that remained was to open the lattice door and step outside. But if he blundered here, all his hard work would come to nothing. He strained his ears and patiently tried to listen for footsteps on the street outside. There was dead silence and no sign of anyone. Only the sound of a koto being played somewhere could be heard, extremely peacefully. Mustering his courage, he quietly opened the lattice door. Then, acting nonchalant, wearing the expression of a guest who had just taken his leave, he stepped out into the street. As expected, there was not a soul in sight. Every street in that block was a quiet residential area. About 4 or 5 blocks from the old woman's house, an old stone wall belonging to some shrine ran continuously facing the street. After making sure no one was watching, Fukiya dropped the murder weapon, the jackknife, and his bloody gloves into a gap in that stone wall. Then he strolled aimlessly toward a small nearby park that he always made a point of visiting during his walks. He sat on a park bench and spent a long time watching children playing on the swings with an utterly peaceful expression on his face. On his way back, he stopped by a police station and said, "I just found this wallet. It seems to have quite a lot of money in it, so I am turning it in," handing over the wallet in question. Answering the police officer's questions, he gave the location and time he found it, which of course was a plausible fabrication, and his own address and name, which were true. He then received something like a receipt on a printed piece of paper with his name and the amount of money written on it. Indeed, this was undoubtedly an extraordinary method, but in terms of safety, it was the best, since the old woman's money, no one knew it had been halved, was right where it belonged. The owner of this lost wallet would absolutely never appear. After 1 year, it would unquestionably fall into Fukiya's hands, and he could spend it openly without fear of anyone. He had adopted this measure after thinking it through completely. If he were to hide it somewhere, it might be snatched away by someone else due to some coincidence. Keeping it himself would be, without a doubt, too dangerous. Furthermore, by this method, even if the old woman had recorded the serial numbers of the bills, there was absolutely nothing to worry about, although he had investigated this point as much as possible and was generally reassured. Surely even God wouldn't know that there is a guy who would turn the goods he stole into the police, he muttered to himself, stifling a laugh. The next day, Fukiya awoke from his usual peaceful sleep in a room at his boarding house, yawned, unfolded the newspaper delivered to his bedside, and scanned the local news section. He was briefly surprised to discover an unexpected fact there, but it was by no means something to worry about. On the contrary, it was an unforeseen stroke of luck for him. That is, his friend Saito had been named as a suspect. The reason given for the suspicion was that he possessed a large sum of money unsuited to his status. Since I am Saito's closest friend, it's only natural for me to go to the police station now and ask various questions, Fukiya thought. He quickly changed his clothes and hurriedly set out for the police station. It was the exact same station where he had turned in the wallet the day before. Why hadn't he turned the wallet into a police station in a different jurisdiction? Well, that too was done deliberately, in line with his unique philosophy of artlessness, wearing an appropriately worried expression, neither too much nor too little. He asked to see Saito. However, as expected, this was not permitted. Therefore, he asked various questions about why Saito had been suspected and was able to clarify the situation to some extent. Fukiya imagined the following. Yesterday, Saito returned home before the maid. It was shortly after Fukiya had accomplished his goal and left, and naturally he discovered the old woman's corpse. However, before immediately reporting it to the police, he must have thought of something, namely, that flower pot. If this was the work of a thief, perhaps the money inside was gone. Perhaps it was out of a bit of curiosity. He checked there, but surprisingly, the money was right there as it should be. Seeing that, it is quite understandable, though a truly shallow thought, that Saito had evil intentions. No one knew the hiding place, and it would undoubtedly be interpreted that the murderer who killed the old woman had stolen it. These circumstances must have been an irresistible temptation for anyone. What did he do after that? According to the police officer's story, he reported the murder to the police with an innocent face. However, what an indiscreet man. He remained unconcerned with the stolen money stuffed inside his belly band. It seems he never imagined he would be physically searched on the spot. But wait, how on earth will Saito excuse himself? Depending on how things unfold, couldn't this become dangerous? Fukiya considered this in various ways. When the money was found, he might have answered, "It's mine." Indeed, since no one knows the amount or hiding place of the old woman's wealth, that defense would tentatively hold up. But isn't the amount entirely too large? So, ultimately, he would end up stating the facts. But would the court accept that? Unless another suspect emerges, it's highly unlikely they would acquit him before then. If things go well, he might even be charged with murder. That would be perfect, but... By the way, as the judge interrogates him, various facts will probably come to light. For example, that he told me when he discovered the money's hiding place, or that I went into the old woman's room and talked with her 2 days before the crime, and furthermore, that I am poor and struggling with tuition fees. However, these were all things Fukiya had taken into account beforehand when making this plan, and no matter how much he thought about it, he couldn't imagine any facts more disadvantageous to him than those being drawn from Saito's mouth. Returning from the police station, Fukiya ate a late breakfast, at which time he told the maid who brought his meal about the incident, and went to school as usual. At school, rumors about Saito were the sole topic of conversation. He became the center of those rumors, speaking half triumphantly. The Psychological Test, Part 4 of 6. Now readers, those of you familiar with the nature of detective stories are well aware that the story by no means ends here. Indeed, that is exactly the case. Truth be told, everything up to this point is merely the premise of the story. What the author truly wants you to read is what follows. In other words, the circumstances of how Fukiya's meticulously planned crime was discovered. The examining judge in charge of this case was the famous Judge Kasamori. He was not only an excellent judge in the ordinary sense, but he was even more famous for having a somewhat eccentric hobby. That is, he was a sort of amateur psychologist, and in cases where judgment could not possibly be passed using ordinary methods, he often achieved success in the end by utilizing his abundant knowledge of psychology. Although he was short on experience and young in years, his brilliance was almost wasted on being a mere examining judge at a district court. Everyone thought that this old woman's murder case too would be effortlessly solved in the hands of Judge Kasamori. Judge Kasamori himself thought the same. As always, he intended to thoroughly investigate the case in the preliminary hearing and handle it so that absolutely no trouble would remain by the time of the public trial. However, as the investigation progressed, the difficulties of the case gradually became apparent. The police simply insisted on Isamu Saito's guilt. Judge Kasamori could not deny that there was some reason in their assertion. After all, despite having summoned and meticulously examined everyone who had any trace of entering the old woman's house while she was alive, whether they were her debtors, tenants, or mere acquaintances, not a single one was suspicious. Seiichiro Fukiya, of course, was among them. As long as no other suspects emerged, there was no choice but to determine that the most suspicious person, Isamu Saito, was the culprit. Furthermore, what was most disadvantageous to Saito was his inherently timid nature. He was completely intimidated by the atmosphere of the courtroom and could not answer questions clearly and briskly. Getting flustered, he frequently retracted previous statements, forgot things he should have naturally known, and made unnecessary disadvantageous statements. The more he panicked, the more he deepened the suspicion against himself. This was because he had the weakness of having stolen the old woman's money. Were it not for that, given that he was quite a smart man, no matter how timid he was, he wouldn't have done such clumsy things. His position was truly one to be pitied. But did this mean Judge Kasamori was ready to recognize Saito as the murderer? He simply didn't have the confidence to do so. There was nothing but suspicion. The man himself naturally did not confess, and there was no conclusive evidence otherwise. Thus, a month passed since the incident. The preliminary hearing was not yet concluded. The judge was beginning to feel a bit impatient. Right at that moment, a welcome report was brought to him by the chief of the police station with jurisdiction over the old woman's murder. It was that on the day of the incident, a wallet containing 5,200 and some odd yen was found in a town not far from the old woman's house, and the person who turned it in was a student named Seiichiro Fukiya, the best friend of the suspect Saito. Due to an oversight by the officials in charge, this had gone unnoticed until today. But seeing that the owner of this large sum of money had not appeared even after a month, couldn't there be some meaning to it? They were reporting this just to be sure. Judge Kasamori, who had been completely at a loss, felt as if he saw a ray of light upon receiving this report. Procedures to summon Seiichiro Fukiya were immediately carried out. However, despite the judge's enthusiasm, the results of Fukiya's interrogation seemed to yield little. In response to the question of why he had not stated the fact that he had found that large sum of money when he was questioned at the time of the incident, he answered that he had not thought it had anything to do with the murder case. There was ample reason for this answer. Since the old woman's wealth had been discovered inside Saito's bellyband, who would imagine that other money, especially money lost on the street, was part of the old woman's wealth? But could this be a coincidence? The fact that on the day of the incident, at a place not too far from the scene, the best friend of the primary suspect, and according to Saito's statement, he also knew the hiding place in the flower pot, had found this large sum of money. Could this really be a coincidence? The judge agonized, trying to find some meaning in it. What the judge found most regrettable was that the old woman had not kept a record of the serial numbers on the bills. If only they had that, it would immediately become clear whether this suspicious money was related to the case or not. If only I could grasp just one solid clue, no matter how small, the judge thought, devoting all his talents to the problem. The investigation of the scene was repeated numerous times. The old woman's family relations were thoroughly investigated, yet nothing was gained, and so another half a month passed in vain. The only possibility, the judge thought, was to deduce that Fukiya had stolen half of the old woman's savings, hidden the rest exactly as it was, put the stolen money in a wallet, and made it look like he had found it on the street. But could such a ridiculous thing be possible? They had naturally examined the wallet, but there were no clues there. Besides, Fukiya had calmly stated that he had passed in front of the old woman's house while on a walk that day. Would a culprit say such a bold thing? First of all, the whereabouts of the most important murder weapon were unknown. The search of Fukiya's boarding house had yielded nothing. However, speaking of the murder weapon, wasn't it the same for Saito? So, who on earth should he suspect? There was not a single piece of conclusive evidence. As the police chief and others said, if you suspected Saito, it certainly seemed like him. But on the other hand, it wasn't impossible to suspect Fukiya either. The only thing known was that, as a result of all the searches over this month and a half, no other suspects existed besides those two. Having exhausted all his options, Judge Kasamori finally decided it was time to play his trump card. He resolved to subject the two suspects to the psychological test with which he had frequently succeeded in the past. The Psychological Test, Part 5 of 6. When Seiichiro Fukiya received his first summons a few days after the incident, he learned that the examining judge in charge was Mr. Kasamori, a famous amateur psychologist. At that time, anticipating this ultimate scenario, he was more than a little dismayed. Even he had never imagined that psychological tests were being conducted in Japan, even if it was just out of one individual's eccentric hobby. From various books, he knew all too well what a psychological test was. Overwhelmed by this great blow, he lost the composure to feign nonchalance and continue attending school. Instead, claiming illness, he shut himself up in a room at his boarding house. There, he thought only of how he should get through this ordeal. He continued to think with the same, or even greater, meticulousness and zeal as he had before committing the murder. What kind of psychological test would Judge Kasamori conduct? It was impossible to predict. So, Fukiya recalled all the methods he knew and considered whether there was any countermeasure for each one. However, since psychological tests were originally designed to uncover false statements, it seemed theoretically impossible to further deceive them. According to Fukiya's thinking, psychological tests could be broadly divided into two categories based on their nature. One relied on purely physiological reactions, and the other was conducted through words. The former is a method where the examiner asks various questions related to the crime, and the subject's minute physical reactions are recorded by appropriate devices, attempting to grasp the truth that could never be known through ordinary interrogation. This is based on the theory that even if a person lies with words or facial expressions, they cannot hide the excitement of their nerves themselves, which manifests as minute physical symptoms. As for the methods, there are various ones. For example, discovering minute movements of the hand with the help of an automatograph. A method to ascertain the movement of the eyeballs by a certain means. A method to measure the depth and speed of breathing with a pneumograph. A method to measure the pitch and speed of the pulse with a sphygmograph. A method to measure the blood volume in the limbs with a plethysmograph. A method to discover minute sweating on the palms with a galvanometer. A method to observe the degree of muscle contraction caused by lightly striking the knee joint, and various other similar methods. For example, if unexpectedly asked, "You are the one who killed the old woman, aren't you?" he had the confidence to reply with a calm face, "On what evidence are you saying such a thing?" But at that moment, wouldn't his pulse unnaturally quicken or his breathing speed up? Wasn't it absolutely impossible to prevent that? He hypothesized various situations and experimented in his mind. Strangely enough, however, questions he asked himself, no matter how risky or unexpected they were, did not seem to cause any changes in his body. Of course, he couldn't say for sure since he didn't have tools to measure minute changes, but as long as he couldn't feel the nervous excitement itself, the resulting physical changes shouldn't occur either. While continuing various experiments and conjectures, Fukiya suddenly hit upon an idea. It was whether practice might not hinder the effectiveness of the psychological test. In other words, wouldn't the nervous reaction to the same question be weaker the second time than the first, and weaker the third time than the second? In short, getting used to it. As can be understood by considering various other cases, this has a lot of potential. The fact that there is no reaction to self-interrogation is ultimately the same logic. It must be because there is an expectation before the question is asked. Therefore, he examined every single one of the tens of thousands of words in the Jiren dictionary and extracted all the words that he might be questioned about, even slightly, and he spent a week practicing his nerves against them. Now the next is the method of testing through words. There was nothing to fear about this either. No, rather, it is exactly because they are words that it is easy to fake. There are various methods for this, but the most common one is the same method that psychoanalysts use when examining patients: association diagnosis. They read aloud several meaningless words in sequence, such as shoji, paper sliding door, desk, ink, or pen, and have the subject utter the words they associate with those words as quickly as possible without thinking. For example, for shoji, there might be various associations like window, sill, paper, or door, but any will do. They make the subject say the word that suddenly comes to mind at that moment. Then, among those meaningless words, they secretly mix in words related to the crime, such as knife, blood, money, or wallet, and examine the associations for them. First of all, the most thoughtless person, in the case of this old woman's murder, might inadvertently answer money to the word flower pot. This is because stealing money from the bottom of the flower pot has left the deepest impression. In doing so, he would have confessed to his crime. But a slightly more thoughtful person, even if the word money floated in their mind, would suppress it and answer, for example, pottery. There are two methods against such deception. One is to repeat the round of tested words once more after a short interval. Then, while naturally given answers mostly remain the same, deliberately fabricated answers will, 9 times out of 10, be different from the first time. For example, answering pottery the first time to flower pot, and soil the second time. The other method is to precisely record the time from when the question is asked until the answer is obtained using a device, and by its speed. For example, if it took 1 second to answer door to shoji, but 3 seconds to answer pottery to flower pot, though in reality it's not this simple, it means the subject took time to suppress the initial association that appeared for flower pot, thus making the subject suspicious. This delay in time sometimes does not appear on the word in question, but on the next meaningless word. There is also a method of explaining the situation at the time of the crime in detail and having them repeat it. If they are the true culprit, when repeating it, they will involuntarily blurt out the truth that differs in minor details from what they were told. I must apologize to readers familiar with psychological tests for this overly tedious description. However, if I were to omit this, the entire story would become ambiguous to other readers, so it was truly unavoidable. Needless to say, practice is necessary against this kind of test, just like the previous case, but what is even more important, according to Fukiya, is to be innocent, to not use petty tricks. For flower pot, answering openly with money or pine is actually the safest method. This is because even if Fukiya were not the culprit, It is natural for him to be thoroughly familiar with the facts of the crime to some extent due to the judge's interrogation and other factors. And the fact that there was money at the bottom of the flower pot must be his most recent and profound impression. So isn't it perfectly natural for the association process to work that way? Also, by this means, he would be safe even if forced to repeat the state of the crime scene. The only problem is the issue of time. This also requires practice. When flower pot comes up, he needs to practice answering money or pine without the slightest hesitation. He spent several more days on this practice. In this way, his preparations were completely in order. He also, on the other hand, took one advantageous circumstance into account. Thinking of that, even if he were faced with unexpected questions, or going a step further, showed an unfavorable reaction to an expected question, he had nothing to fear at all. The reason being, Fukiya was not the only one being tested. No matter how innocent that overly sensitive Isamu Saito might be, could he really remain calm and collected in the face of various questions? Probably, wouldn't it be natural for him, at the very least, to show reactions similar to Fukiya's? As Fukiya thought about it, he gradually became relieved. He felt like humming a tune. Now, he even began to look forward to Judge Kasamori's summons. The Psychological Test, Part 6 of 6. I will spare you the tedious details of how Judge Kasamori's psychological test was conducted, what kind of reactions the neurotic Saito showed, and how calmly Fukiya responded to the test, and proceed directly to the results. It was the day after the psychological test was conducted. As Judge Kasamori was tilting his head in thought in his study at home, with the documents recording the test results in front of him, the calling card of Kogoro Akechi was brought to him. Those who have read The Case of the Murder on D Hill will know somewhat what kind of man this Kogoro Akechi is. Since then, he had frequently been involved in difficult criminal cases, displaying his rare talents, and was now well recognized not only by experts but also by the general public. He had also become acquainted with Judge Kasamori through a certain case. Guided by the maid, Akechi's smiling face appeared in the judge's study. "You're working hard, aren't you?" Akechi said, peering at the judge's desk. "Well, I'm completely at a loss this time," the judge replied, turning toward his guest. "It's about the old woman's murder case, right?" "How were the results of the psychological test?" Akechi asked. "Well, the results are clear," the judge continued, "but somehow I just can't be convinced. Yesterday I tried the pulse test and the association diagnosis, and Fukiya had almost no reaction. Look at this. Here are the questions and the pulse records. Saito shows remarkably obvious reactions, doesn't he? It's the same with the association test. You can see it just by looking at the reaction time for this stimulus word, flower pot." While Fukiya answered in an even shorter time than for other meaningless words, Saito took 6 seconds. "You see, it's very clear," the judge said. "Looking at this, Saito is doing various deliberate tricks. What's most obvious is his slow reaction time. On the other hand, Fukiya is very natural. He answers pine to flower pot, hide to oiled paper, and murder to crime. If he were the culprit, he calmly answered associations he should definitely have hidden, and in a short time at that." "You could look at it that way," Akechi said, thinking about something. "Looking at this, it's really interesting," Akechi began, holding the record. "While Fukiya's answers are all somewhat material and intellectual, Saito's have a very gentle quality, don't they? They're lyrical. By the way, have you ever considered the weaknesses of psychological tests? For example, suppose a highly nervous, innocent man falls under suspicion. Could he really remain calm during a psychological test? Wouldn't a psychological test conducted under such circumstances end up framing the innocent?" "Are you talking about Isamu Saito?" The judge made a bitter face. Then, if Saito is innocent, who on earth killed the old woman? I have an idea, Akechi replied with a smile. Looking at the results of this association test, I think Fukiya is the culprit. Could you somehow summon him here? If you do, I will surely uncover the truth for you. Akechi's wish was granted, and a messenger ran to Fukiya's boarding house. Fukiya came immediately, overjoyed, completely oblivious to the terrifying trap that lay there. After explaining the reasons for finding Saito guilty, Judge Kasamori added, I feel truly sorry for having suspected you. He introduced Akechi as an acquaintance, a lawyer representing the dead old woman's heir. Fukiya, completely at ease, chatted eloquently. As dusk approached, Fukiya prepared to leave. Oh, I almost forgot, Akechi said cheerfully. It's really a trivial matter. I don't know if you are aware, but there was a 2-panel folding screen set up in the room where the murder took place, and it's become a problem because the owner says there's a slight scratch on it. Since you frequented that house, do you happen to remember if there was a scratch on it before? Fukiya felt a slight chill at the word screen, but he was quickly relieved. As the judge knows well, I only entered that room once, and that was 2 days before the incident, he said with a smirk. But I remember that screen. I'm certain there were no scratches on it when I saw it. After all, a scratch on the brightly colored face of Komachi would be obvious at a glance. Thank you, Akechi said happily. Actually, I thought from the beginning that you must know about the screen, because in the record of yesterday's psychological test, you gave a special answer of folding screen to the question painting. But speaking of noticing things, there's actually one more thing, Akechi continued. There were 8 dangerous words included in yesterday's association test, and you passed them completely perfectly. Too perfectly, in fact. However, your reaction times to these are all, albeit slightly, faster than for the other meaningless words. For example, it took you only 0.6 seconds to answer pine to flower pot. What does this mean? Shall I guess your feelings? You knew the dangers of the psychological test well and prepared in advance, didn't you? However, your preparation was a bit too thorough, and although you probably didn't intend to answer quickly, those words alone became faster. This was certainly a grave mistake. This innocence, in other words, not using petty tricks, is your striking characteristic, Akechi pressed on. Because I knew that, I asked you about the folding screen. By the way, let me ask Mr. Kasamori, when was the folding screen with the 6 immortal poets brought into that old woman's house? It was the day before the crime, in other words, the 4th of last month, the judge replied. What, the day before? Fukiya just said clearly that he saw it in that room 2 days before the incident, on the 3rd. It's quite illogical. This was the trap Akechi had planned from the beginning. Well, we have a problem, Akechi said. This is a massive blunder that cannot be undone. Why did you say you saw something you didn't see? Remembering the painting of the 6 immortal poets is fatal. Probably, trying to tell the truth, you accidentally told a lie. I'm sure you never imagined that a lawyer who has nothing to do with this case would set a trap to make you confess, did you? Fukiya, his face pale and sweating profusely, remained silently still. He knew that the more he defended himself now, the more he would expose his flaws. Akechi then revealed that someone had been taking notes on their conversation in the next room and made Fukiya sign his confession. Fukiya knew perfectly well that refusing to sign would be pointless, and he signed it, acknowledging Akechi's astonishing reasoning.